Hello, History 101, and welcome to Founders Give Me Liberty Part 2 in Chapter 5. In this chapter, we're going to discuss the American Revolution roughly from 1763 to 1783, including the run-up. On the night of August 26, 1765, a violent crowd of Bostonians assaulted the elegant home of Massachusetts Governor and Chief Justice Thomas Hutchinson. Hutchinson and his family escaped mere moments before the attack, but the crowd destroyed or carried off most of their possessions and left only the four outer walls of the home standing. The immediate cause of the riot was the recently enacted Stamp Act, which had caused colonists to feel that their liberties had been violated. Critics of the act spread the rumor that Hutchinson had encouraged its passage when privately he'd opposed it, and only a day before he'd helped disperse a crowd attacking the property of his relative Andrew Oliver, who'd been appointed to administer the new law. Ebenezer McIntosh, leader of both of the crowds, was arrested after the destruction of Hutchinson's home, but released after the Loyal Nine, a group of merchants and craftsmen opposed to the Stamp Act, intervened. They had not intended for violence to escalate that far and promised to keep the further resistance peaceful. Nonetheless, the riot convinced Hutchinson that there must be an abridgment of what are called English liberties for effective British rule in America, though it was doubted whether colonists would accept such an abridgment. The riot was only an episode in a half-century of popular protests and political upheaval in an era that has since been labeled as the Age of Revolution. And that began in British North America, spread to Europe, the Caribbean, and eventually culminated in Latin American wars for independence. Liberty emerged as the foremost rallying cry for political discontent, and it has rarely played so central a role in political debate and social upheaval. The attack on Hutchinson's home demonstrated the depths of feeling aroused by Britain's efforts to impose greater control over its empire, but it also showed the dynamism of the revolutionary process. The crowd's resentment of wealth and power was quite different from colonial leaders' objections to taxation, and the Stamp Act crisis inaugurated both a struggle for American liberty in relation to Great Britain and for an extension within. Here we see a French engraving that depicts New Yorkers tearing down the statue of King George III in July 1776 after the approval of the Declaration of Independence. Slaves are doing the work while whites look on. The statue was later melted down to make bullets for the Continental Army. This lecture, we're going to be discussing the beginnings and the revolution itself, as well as our declarations of Constitution and independence in securing our new American country. Our first focus question: what were the roots and significance of the Stamp Act controversy? The experience and costs of the 7 Years' War laid Great Britain, where King George assumed the throne in 1760, to consolidate its growing empire and to make colonists share in the costs. No one on either side of the Atlantic expected that 2 decades later would bring the separation of American colonies from the mother country. The 7 Years' War highlighted to rulers in London the importance of the empire and to Britain's well-being and status as a great power. They now believed that regulations were needed to protect the continuation of its prosperity. Prior to 1763, Parliament had occasionally passed measures to regulate the direction of the colonial economy, and colonists frequently ignored these laws. Regarding the internal affairs of the colonies, the British government seemed uninterested, but the Board of Trade began a more hands-on approach in the late 1740s. It demanded that colonial lawmakers heed royal instructions, but the 7 Years' War dampened the trend. During the 7 Years' War, the British had treated the colonists as equals, recognizing their contributions to winning the conflict. After the war in the mid-1760s, the British had returned to viewing the colonists as subordinates whose role was to enrich the mother country. Without precedent, British rulers sought imperial reforms to make administration of the American colonies more systematic and efficient, and to raise funds to help pay for the war, which had cost Britain far more than its colonies, and to further finance their empire. To them, it seemed fair to force Americans to follow the Navigation Acts, to help reduce the war debt, and to pay for continued British protection. Millions of Britons had no representatives in Parliament, but according to the theory of virtual representation, these Britons were constituents of each member of Parliament, each of whom had the duty to represent the whole empire, not simply his district. Americans' argument that they couldn't be taxed without enjoying direct representation in Parliament did not find much support in Britain. In the early 1760s, British efforts to combat smuggling by issuing general search warrants called writs of assistance and the proclamation of 1763 barring further settlement on lands west of the Appalachian Mountains alarmed many colonists. While the Sugar Act of 1764 actually reduced taxes on French molasses imported from the French West Indies to North America, it also enacted a new machinery to combat smuggling. Furthermore, it strengthened admiralty courts where smugglers could be judged without the benefit of trial by jury, countering colonial assemblies' tendencies to acquit tax evaders. Colonists ignored the reduction in the tax rate and viewed the act as an attempt to force payment of a tax that they previously would have evaded altogether. A revenue act also enlarged the list of enumerated goods under the Navigation Acts. Together, these measures threatened colonials' profit and seemed likely to exacerbate an already serious economic downturn at the end of the 7 Years' War. The Stamp Act of 1765 represented a departure in imperial regulation and a direct tax on the colonies rather than a tax on trade. It required all printed materials to carry a stamp purchased from the authorities. The purpose of this was to raise revenue without consultation of the colonial assemblies. Previous acts had offended only segments of the colonial population, but the Stamp Act offended a much broader portion of the population, especially those in the public sphere who relied on printed materials and followed political affairs. Additionally, the prospect of a standing British army in the colonies alarmed colonists. The Stamp Act directly challenged colonial elites who controlled the revenue and its expenditure through colonial assemblies, and these elites defended their authority in the name of liberty. The opposition was the first great drama of the Revolutionary period. Here we see an engraving from a Massachusetts almanac published in 1774 that depicts Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson, whose house had been destroyed by a mob 9 years earlier. The devil carries a list of Hutchinson's crimes. It was common in this period to use religious symbols to demonize political opponents. According to the doctrine of virtual representation, the House of Commons represented all residents of the British Empire, whether or not they could vote for their members. In the 1775 cartoon criticizing the idea, a blinded Britannia on the far right stumbles into a pit. Next to her, two colonists complain of having been robbed by British taxation. In the background, according to an accompanying explanation of the cartoon, stand the Catholic city of Quebec and the Protestant town of Boston. The latter is in flames. British imperial rulers and the colonists had different ideas of the British Empire. The British saw the empire as a system of unequal parts in which different principles governed different areas, and all were subject to Parliament's authority. Colonists in the Americas and India viewed the empire as an association of equals in which free colonists had the same rights as Britons at home. In late 1765, the Stamp Act Congress, which with delegates from most of the American colonies, affirmed Americans' loyalty to Great Britain while insisting on their right to consent to taxation. Some opponents of the Stamp Act distinguished between internal taxes like the stamp duty, claiming Parliament lacked the right to establish such measures, and revenue legitimately raised through direct taxation and regulation. Americans no longer considered Parliament the safeguard of English liberty, but rather its principal enemy. The boycott of British goods and other forms of resistance represented the first widely intercolonial cooperative action, and in a sense, Britain's attempts to impose uniformity inadvertently united America. Prince Simbo, a former Connecticut slave who served in the Continental Army, engraved this powder horn with the all-seeing eye, a symbol of protection. Simbo was one of several thousand black soldiers who fought for the American independence. This is an engraving of James Otis that graced the cover of the Boston Almanac in 1770. He's flanked by the ancient gods Hercules and Minerva. Minerva is carrying a liberty cap. No word was more often used for resistance than liberty. Mock funerals portraying the death of liberty were held, and other symbols of liberty proliferated, such as hangings in effigy of stamp distributors and tax collectors. Open-air meetings were held beneath a liberty tree, where stamp distributor Andrew Oliver was hung in effigy, and a space that came to be called Liberty Hall. A pine mast was erected at a meeting place for the Stamp Act opponents and was called a Liberty Pole. Even before its passage, a committee of correspondence was formed in Boston to encourage widespread intercolonial opposition to sugar and currency acts. The action led to similar committees being formed across the colonies for the exchange of ideas and resistance information. Initiated by colonial elites, the resistance to the Stamp Act was similar but much more widespread. Political debate pervaded in the colonies and drew large crowds across class and occupational lines. In cities such as New York and Boston, crowds often organized by the Sons of Liberty destroyed the stamps and forced those administering the law to resign. The coercive activities of the Sons of Liberty, supported by mostly urban artisans, laborers, and sailors, frightened imperial officers in the colonies as well as colonial elites who opposed the Stamp Act but preferred orderly and peaceful protest. Through Americans' resistance, along with pressure from London merchants and manufacturers afraid of losing markets, the Parliament led the Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act in 1766. That body simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, which affirmed that Parliament had the authority and power to pass laws in the future that affected the colonies, including new taxes. The 1760s also saw considerable internal social turmoil within the colonies. In the western backcountry of many colonies, the conflicting land claims of settlers, speculators, colonial governments, and Indians sparked disputes. Rural settlers and farmers had long resented the power and influence of land speculators and large proprietors. In the mid-1760s, a group of wealthy backcountry South Carolina settlers calling themselves the Regulators protested the underrepresentation of Western settlements in the colony's assembly and the failure to establish local governments that could regulate land titles and impose law and order. In North Carolina, groups of small farmers taking the same name refused to pay taxes, disrupted courts, and attacked local officials and the property of land speculators, merchants, and lawyers. These armed farmers were suppressed only in 1771 by the colony's militia. In the mid-1760s, tenants on large estates of landowners in New York's Hudson River Valley, calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, stopped paying rent and began to seize land, but they were also suppressed by colonial militia and British troops. Small farmers in Vermont and other parts of New England also took up arms to defend their land claims and resist colonial authorities. Such social turmoil made some of the colonial elites fear that British resistance to imperial authority threatened their own power and authority over their subordinates within the colonies, and they were much more reluctant to challenge British authority when the next imperial crisis arose. This teapot protesting the Stamp Act was actually produced in England, but it was marketed in colonial America, illustrating the close political and economic connections between the two. This is a British engraving from 1766 marking the repeal of the Stamp Act. A funeral procession on the banks of the River Thames in London includes Prime Minister George Grenville carrying a coffin, noting that the act was born in 1765 and died later that year. Two large containers are labeled Stamps from America. Stamps returned because they were no longer needed. And a black cloth from America used for the funeral. In the background, a warehouse contains goods to be shipped to America now that the boycott of British imports has ended. And notice the dog in the lower left corner lifting his legs on the Prime Minister's robes. Next focus question. What events sharpened the division between Britain and the colonists in the late 1760s and early 1770s? In 1767, the British government imposed a new set of taxes on American colonies designed by Chancellor of the Exchequer Charles Townshend, the government's chief financial minister. Taking at their word American statements that they did not object to taxes on trade, the Townshend Acts taxed goods imported to the colonies and established a new board of customs and commissioners to collect the taxes, suppress smuggling, and raise the funds to free judges and their governors from their financial dependence on colonial assemblies. Although American merchants opposed the duties, the colonial opposition developed more slowly compared to the response to the Stamp Act. The Townsend Crisis led John Dickinson to write the Letters from a Farmer to Pennsylvania, one of the most important statements of the American stance. It argued for a reconciliation with the mother country if colonists were granted the traditional rights of Englishmen. The publication demonstrated that Enlightenment ideals were familiar to colonists while also showing that American leaders felt that political debate should be held among the educated elite. A colonial boycott on imported British goods developed in Boston and spread to the southern colonies, where many southern planters hoped to use the boycott to reduce their debt to British merchants. Boycotters celebrated the virtue of American resistance and denigrated the luxury of British society by producing their own homespun clothing. Although urban artists welcomed an end to competition from British imports and strongly supported non-importation, urban merchants were at first reluctant to honor the boycott, and in some cities, extra-legal committees and crowds attempted to enforce it. Boston was the center of the resistance. Royal British troops had been stationed there since the 1768 riot against British attempts to enforce trade regulations, and the unpopular troops had been competing for jobs on the waterfront with the city's laborers. On March 5, 1770, a fight between Bostonians and British soldiers escalated into an armed confrontation, since known as the Boston Massacre. This left at least 5 Bostonians dead. One of the casualties was Crispus Attucks, a sailor of mixed Indian, African, and white ancestry, who later came to be known as the first martyr of the American Revolution. The commander and 8 soldiers were put on trial and defended by John Adams, who opposed both British policies and lower-class crowd actions against them. Though only 2 of the British soldiers were convicted of manslaughter and the rest were found not guilty, Paul Revere and other colonists helped stir up indignation against the British through inaccurate but widely circulated propaganda depicting the incident as a massacre of unarmed Bostonians. Non-importation temporarily cut British imports by a third, and although the boycott on the Townsend duties faltered by 1770, British merchants' fear of future trade disruptions led to the repeal of all of the Townsend duties, except for the tax on tea. The British also agreed to remove the troops from Boston, and American merchants, who also found that they couldn't do without the British goods, abandoned the boycott. British American Protestants were also troubled by rumors that the Anglican Church planned to send bishops to the colonies and, worried that religious courts to punish dissenters would be established, further feared for their liberties. The next colonial crisis demonstrated how events throughout the British Empire reverberated in America. The East India Company was a giant trading monopoly that effectively ruled recently acquired British possessions in India. When a speculative bubble destroyed the company's stock, in which many British merchants, bankers, and other elites had invested, the British government decided to help rescue the company by marketing its surplus tea in its North American colonies. By this time, tea was no longer a luxury good, but rather a consumer necessity popular among all social classes in Britain and America. The British government, headed by Lord North, gave the company advantages when it allowed it to dump low-priced tea on the American market, which undercut colonial merchants and smugglers. And it wanted to use the taxes on the imported tea to help pay for the cost of the colonial government, another move that threatened colonial assemblies' control over finance. Although the tea tax was nothing new, many colonists argued that a tax on a large new body of tea imports would acknowledge Britain's right to tax the colonies. Mounting opposition culminated in what later came to be known as the Boston Tea Party, in which colonists disguised as Indians dumped the tea from British ships into Boston Harbor, causing an enormous loss to the East India Company. North's government and the Parliament responded with a series of punitive laws that the colonists came to call the Intolerable Acts. They closed the port of Boston until the East India Company had been compensated, alerted the Massachusetts Charter in 1691 by curtailing the town meetings and authorizing the government to appoint council members previously elected, and allowing the British military commanders to house troops in colonists' private homes. Simultaneously, Parliament passed the Quebec Act, which extended Canada's boundaries and allowed for legal toleration of the Roman Catholic Church in that new British province. Meant to secure the allegiance of Britain's new subjects, the Quebec Act also caused many colonists, especially New England Protestants, to fear that the British now threatened both their political and religious freedoms. This is the Boston Massacre. Less than a month after the Boston Massacre of 1770, in which 5 colonists died, Paul Revere produced this engraving of the event. Although it inaccurately depicts what was actually a disorganized brawl between the residents of Boston and British soldiers, this image became one of the most influential pieces of political propaganda of the Revolutionary era. And this is the Bostonians paying the exciseman, a 1774 engraving showing colonists pouring tea down the throat of a tax collector who'd been covered with tar and feathers. A noose hangs menacingly from the Liberty Tree nearby. In the background is the Boston Tea Party. This is an attempt to land a British in America, an engraving from a London magazine published in 1769. Here, a crowd of New Englanders prevents a ship carrying a bishop dispatched by the Church of England from landing. The crowd carries the works of political philosopher John Locke and a banner proclaiming liberty and freedom of conscience. It hurls the writings of Protestant theologian John Calvin at the bishop. Our next focus question: what key events marked the move towards American independence? By 1774, British actions had eroded the imperial government's legitimacy among the many colonists, and opposition to the Intolerable Acts spread to small towns and rural areas that had not yet participated in the resistance. While colonists, particularly in New England, intimidated, harassed, and sometimes assaulted British officers, and colonists who supported British policies, in September, a convention of delegates from towns across Massachusetts issued the Suffolk Resolves. This urged Americans to refuse to obey the new laws, withhold taxes, and prepare for war. To coordinate resistance to the acts, that month a Continental Congress also met in Philadelphia. Composed of political leaders from all of the colonies except Georgia, it included men such as John Adams and his more radical cousin Sam Adams of Massachusetts, and from Virginia, George Washington and Patrick Henry, the later famously declaring to his fellow Virginians, "Give me liberty or give me death." The Congress adjourned in October of 1774 after it agreed to meet the following May if its demands were not met. It endorsed the Suffolk Resolves and formed the Continental Association to halt virtually all trade with Great Britain and the West Indies. The Congress, through the association, authorized the local committees of safety to enforce its policies and act against the enemies of liberty who violated the boycott or used it as an opportunity to raise prices. This was the beginning of a process that transferred effective political power from colonial governments whose authority derived from Great Britain to extra-legal bodies reflecting popular will. By early 1775, thousands of men, many of whom were without property or who had never before been part of a political nation, were serving on these committees, which became laboratories for self-government and soon revolution. By 1775, the notions of British liberty that had infused British American political culture were being invoked against Britain itself by indignant colonists of all backgrounds. As the crisis intensified, more and more Americans based their claims for liberty not just on the historical rights of Englishmen, but also on more abstract natural language of natural rights and universal freedom. This language included John Locke's idea that natural rights had existed long before the establishment of any government, which provided a powerful justification for resistance to British imperial rule. Jefferson insisted that Americans still revered the king, but demanded that the empire henceforth be seen as a collection of equal parts loyal to a constitutional monarch, rather than a system in which one part ruled over the others. When the Second Continental Congress met in May of 1775, war had already begun between British soldiers and armed Massachusetts citizens. The previous month, British forces marching to Concord to seize arms in that town were met in Lexington by militiamen who tried to resist their advance. In Concord, the British that were routed and afterwards retreating to Boston, scores of militiamen and British troops were killed or wounded. These skirmishes initiated the American War for Independence and inspired colonists in New England and elsewhere to take up arms. New England militias laid siege to Boston, and after failed British attempts to break the siege and the arrival of a cannon seized from the British by American militias at Fort Ticonderoga, the British abandoned the city. The Second Continental Congress soon authorized the raising of an army and the printing of money to pay for it, and appointed George Washington to be its commander. Britain responded by declaring the colonies to be in a state of rebellion, and it closed all colonial ports and dispatched thousands of troops. Despite the war's outbreak, many colonists were reluctant to embrace independence from Great Britain. Many were still proud of British political institutions and culture and the power and the glory of the British Empire, and more than a few political leaders worried that the rebellion might cause internal social conflict, particularly between elites and the disenfranchised and less wealthy Americans. Leaders in Massachusetts and Virginia, incensed by the Intolerable Acts and confident of their ability to retain authority in those colonies, supported independence, as did the many Southern leaders who guarded the political liberties and were enraged by a British proclamation in Virginia in late 1775 offering freedom to escaped slaves who enlisted in the Royal Army. In New York and Pennsylvania, consensus was more difficult to establish. Opposition to British policies had animated small farmers and urban artisans who called for greater voice in political life and prompted many leaders to hesitate to call for independence. Some people living in these colonies urged for compromise and predicted that a war would unleash fighting among the colonies themselves. This is the Battle for Concord, depicted in 1775, an engraving by Amos Doolittle, a New Haven silversmith. Under musket fire from the colonials, the British retreat across Concord's North Ridge. In his poem The Concord Hymn, 1837, Ralph Waldo Emerson immortalized this moment. By the rude bridge that arced the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled, here once the embattled farmer stood and fired the shot heard round the world. In March of 1776, James Pike, a soldier in the Massachusetts militia, carved this scene onto his powder horn to commemorate the battles of Lexington and Concord. At the center is the Liberty Tree. In the beginning of 1776, colonists were strangely both engaged in a war against the British Empire and calling for rights within it. In July of 1775, even as Congress organized a continental military, they sent the Olive Branch Petition to George III, reaffirming their loyalty to the crown and hoping for a permanent reconciliation. Ironically, not a colonist but recent immigrant from Philadelphia to England, Thomas Paine offered the arguments that catalyzed the final move towards independence. In Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, published in January of 1776, caustically criticized the British Constitution for its principles of hereditary rule and monarchical government, and argued that the residue of tyranny survived in the form of the monarchy and the aristocratic House of Lords. Paine argued that only a democratic system based on frequent elections with a single written constitution could ensure liberty. Most important, Paine argued that America's future prospects within the British Empire were limited. Once America was free of the Navigation Acts and trading freely within the world, its prosperity would be assured. Free from Great Britain, the colonies would also not be entangled in wars with other European powers, against which American colonists had never had grievances. Paine argued that colonies' memberships in the British Empire was more burdensome than beneficial. He ended the pamphlet by assuring his readers that his American independence was linked with the freedom of people everywhere, and argued that the new nation would become a haven for freedom and an asylum for all mankind. Although most of Paine's ideas were not original, he addressed them to all Americans rather than just the educated political elite, and made them accessible by expressing them in clear, direct, and plain language unusual in most political writing at the time. Common Sense quickly became one of the most successful and influential pamphlets in the history of political writing. The intensification of the wars, combined with Paine's stirring appeal for independence, sparked for more calls for independence in many American communities. Only 6 months elapsed between the publication of Common Sense and the decision of the Second Continental Congress to declare independence. This is Thomas Paine, an advocate for American independence in a 1791 portrait. And this is the cover to Common Sense, Thomas Paine's influential pamphlet denouncing the idea of hereditary rule and calling for American independence. On July 2nd, 1776, Congress formally declared the United States an independent nation, and 2 days later it adopted the Declaration of Independence, authored by Thomas Jefferson and revised by Congress before its approval. Most of the Declaration was a long list of grievances directed against King George III, protesting recent policies that threatened to impose on the colonists absolute tyranny. Although a clause condemning the slave trade and criticizing the king for overturning laws limiting slave importation was eliminated after protests by delegates from Georgia and South Carolina. The impact and legacy of the Declaration were contained in its preamble, which was written by Jefferson and stated that all men are created equal, that they were endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these were life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson justified independence by arguing that government derives its powers from the consent of the governed, and that when it threatened its subjects' natural rights, people had the authority to alter or abolish it. The Declaration ultimately asserts the right of revolution. The Declaration of Independence forever altered the meaning of American freedom. It completed the transformation of the object of American independence from the rights of Englishmen to the rights of mankind. Jefferson argued that natural laws, not the British Constitution or the rights of free-born Englishmen, justified America's separation from Britain, and that the Declaration made freedom a universal entitlement for all people, not a privilege to be enjoyed by a corporate body or a people of certain social class. Jefferson drew upon the theories of John Locke, but by substituting the pursuit of happiness for property, in the Lockean triad that opens the Declaration, Jefferson established in America's political culture the open-ended democratic process in which individuals developed their own potential and sought to realize their own life goals. He made individual self-fulfillment, unimpeded by government, a central element of American freedom, removing tradition as an obstacle to Americans' desire to shape society as they saw fit. This is an early draft with corrections of the Declaration of Independence in Thomas Jefferson's own handwriting. Note how the elimination of unnecessary words added to the document's power. All men are created equal and independent became all men are created equal, and inherent and unalienable rights became inalienable. And in the final version, this would be changed to unalienable. The American Revolution created a distinctive definition of national identity resting on freedom. From its beginning, the notion of American exceptionalism, the belief that the United States has a special mission to be a refuge from tyranny, a symbol of freedom, and a model for the rest of the world, has been central to American nationality and nationalism. Paine and others believed that the American Revolution was an event of global historic importance with the power to reshape the world. Without the burden of monarchy, aristocracy, and hereditary privilege of the Old World Europe, America would be a new nation governed by the principles of universal freedom. Apart from the Declaration of Independence, 1776 was a momentous year in North America. Spain established Mission Dolores in the first European settlement in San Francisco to block Russian settlement in the Pacific coast. Indians in San Diego rebelled unsuccessfully against the Spanish, and the Lakota Sioux settled in the Black Hills of North Dakota. Though American colonists were less concerned with the securing of universal human rights for all of mankind than they were with securing international recognition of the independence, Jefferson hoped that the rebellion would signal self-government elsewhere. For over 2 centuries, the Declaration of Independence has inspired generations of Americans denied enjoyment of their natural rights in colonial people all over the world seeking independence. It quickly appeared in French and German, and it was considered so dangerous by the Spanish imperial government that it tried to prevent its translation into Spanish. Numerous anti-colonial movements, the first of which occurred in Flanders, where a break with the Austrian Empire brewed, have modeled their efforts on the Declaration of Independence, and more than half of today's independent countries have similar declarations. In a global context, the Declaration has become an assertion of the right to form independent states rather than listing a citizen's right not to be governmentally abridged. Furthermore, the notion of the will of the people has been adopted all over the world. Even before the end of the Revolution, European colonists and other empires demanded increased local autonomy, often based on American arguments. To the dismay of those who had ruled over them, groups all over the world could speak the language of rights for the people. America is a symbol of liberty, a 1775 engraving from the cover of the Pennsylvania Magazine edited by Thomas Paine soon after his arrival in America. The shield displays the colony's coat of arms. The female figure holding a liberty cap is surrounded by weaponry of the patriotic struggle, including a cartridge box marked Liberty hanging from a tree on the right. Inspired by the American Revolution, British reformer John Cartwright published an appeal for the annual election of Parliament as an essential liberty in Britain. He included engraving contrasting the principles of reform on the left with despotism on the right. Our next focus question: How were American forces able to prevail in the Revolutionary War? For Americans, the challenges to obtaining real independence as opposed to declaring it were enormous, and Britain, which saw its colonists as rebellious traitors, was determined to crush them. The new American army faced the greatest military power in the world, a well-trained, professional, and disciplined army augmented by hired soldiers from the German states such as the Hesse. The world's most powerful navy and the world's most experienced military commanders as well. Americans had local militias and poorly equipped Continental Army, most of whom were undisciplined and no navy to speak of, although it did charter privateers or private ships allowed by Congress to attack British naval and commercial ships. Yet many Americans had military experience, particularly those who fought in the 7 Years' War or who had militia training. Americans were fighting on their own soil for a revolutionary cause that inspired sacrifice and devotion. During the war's 8 years, some 200,000 men served in the Continental Army as volunteers or in the militia, where service was required of every able-bodied man. By the war's end, 1 in 20 of the free white male population in the colonies between the ages of 16 and 45 had died, the equivalent of nearly 3 million deaths in today's population. But the hope for independence survived as long as the American army existed. The British learned that despite their power, the conquest of 13 colonies was an enormous and expensive endeavor which might require higher taxes than Britons in the mother country would resent. The British made a series of mistakes, misjudging the degree of support for independence among the Americans and the capacity for America's citizen soldiers. European rivals, particularly France, welcomed British defeat and could equalize the balance of forces in the struggle if they supported America. The Yankee Doodle entrenchments near Boston, a 1776 British cartoon depicting the American revolutionaries as unimposing citizen soldiers egged on, according to the accompanying text, by a thieving commander and reckless Puritan minister. The British greatly underestimated Americans' fighting ability in the War of Independence. One member of Parliament in 1775 claimed the colonists, quote, were neither soldiers nor could be made so, end quote, and they were naturally cowardly and, quote, incapable of any sort of order or discipline, end quote. Although George Washington at first would not accept black recruits into the Continental Army, he later reversed this policy as British officials offered freedom to Virginia slaves who escaped and served in the British military. Around 5,000 blacks enlisted in the American Army and militia, some of whom were slaves and promised freedom if they served as substitutes for their master or his son. Blacks fighting under George Washington served in racially integrated units, the last Black Americans to do so in regular units until the Korean War. Except for South Carolina and Georgia, the southern colonies also enrolled free blacks and slaves to fight. While these colonies did not explicitly promise the slaves their freedom, many received it individually once the war was concluded, at which time Virginia emancipated slaves who had served in the American Army. But many hundreds of blacks, particularly slaves, found freedom and opportunity by enlisting in the British military instead. Even 17 of George Washington's own slaves fled to British lines and joined the fight against the American colonists. This is American Foot Soldiers in the Yorktown Campaign, a 1781 watercolor by a French officer. It includes a black soldier from the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, an all-black unit of 250 men. British ships are landing sailors on the New Jersey side of the Hudson River in November of 1776. They quickly scaled the Palisades and began pursuing George Washington's retreating army. The sluggish prosecution of the war by British commanders and Washington's determination to avoid direct confrontation in order to buy time and gain international support and to prevent the destruction of the American army made for an inconclusive beginning to the war. Though the British captured New York in 1776 and pushed the Americans back through New Jersey, Washington saved a demoralized and shrinking army in successful surprise attacks in that state, at Trenton in December of 1776 and at Princeton in January of 1777. In October of 1777, a second British army, advancing south from Canada into New York to isolate New England from the rest of the colonies, was surrounded, defeated, and forced to surrender at Saratoga. While the British Army remained quartered in New York, American troops suffered a punishing winter at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. But the victory at Saratoga helped persuade the French in 1778 to recognize the United States and supply it with military assistance. Spain soon joined the war on the American side as well. Though these allies first limited their attacks, the entry of France into the war in particular forced Britain to defend not only America, but also much of its global empire and significantly weakened its capacity to wage war in North America. This is the triumphal entry of royal troops into New York, an engraving showing the army of Sir William Howe occupying the city in 1776. New York would remain in British hands for the duration of the War of Independence. And this is Benjamin Franklin's design for his $3 bill for the new nation. It depicts an eagle fighting a crane with a Latino model, with the Latin motto meaning the outcome is in doubt. Key battles in the North during the War of Independence included Lexington and Concord, which began the armed conflict. The campaign in New York and New Jersey and Saratoga are sometimes called the turning point of the war. In the Trans-Appalachian West, the war took on the character of a borderlands conflict as much as a struggle for independence. Here, where British authority remained weak even after the expulsion of the French in the 7 Years' War, and Indians enjoyed considerable authority, the Patriots' victory marked a decisive shift of power away from native tribes and towards white settlers. Despite the proclamation of 1763, the colonists continued to move westward, leading the Indian tribes to complain about intrusions on their land. Many Patriot leaders, including George Washington, Patrick Henry, and Thomas Jefferson, were deeply involved in the Western land speculation. About 200,000 Native Americans lived east of the Mississippi River in 1790. Like white Americans, Indians divided in allegiance during the War of Independence. Indians chose the side that they felt would advance their own ideas of liberty. Many tribes tried to maintain neutrality only to see themselves break into pro-American and pro-British factions. In the war that raged throughout the western frontier, savagery was not confined to either combatant. The destruction of the middle ground would not be completed until after the War of 1812, but it received major impetus from American independence. In 1778, the center of the war moved to the southern colonies, where the British hoped to take advantage of social tensions between frontier farmers and wealthy planters, enlist many loyalists in the region, and disrupt the economy by encouraging slaves to escape. By 1780, British forces had occupied Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina, and seemed to control much of the South. The year was perhaps the lowest point of the war for Americans. Congress was essentially bankrupt, and the Army, without pay for several months, experienced several mutinies. More and more loyalists were flocking to British lines, along with tens of thousands of slaves. But irregular warfare launched by the colonial militias in the South and a brutal civil war in much of the North and South Carolina and Georgia between Patriot and Loyalist militias, with both sides committing atrocities and destroying property, failed to crush the rebellion in the South. Furthermore, brutal treatment of civilians by forces under Colonel Banastre Tarleton persuaded more Americans to join the Patriot cause. Finally, in 1781, defeats and costly campaigns weakened British forces there commanded by Lord Cornwallis, who moved his army to Yorktown, located on a Virginia peninsula. Washington rushed his forces there and with the troops laid a siege, which, when supported by a French naval blockade, forced Cornwallis to surrender his army there in October of 1781. Imperial rivalry among Europe's great colonial powers had helped create the American colonies, and now it secured their independence as a new nation. After Cornwallis's defeat, public support for the war collapsed in Great Britain, where many thought that the West Indies were much more valuable and merchants hoped to renew trade with America. In 1783, Great Britain recognized America's independence in the Treaty of Paris and ceded the entire area between Canada and Florida east of the Mississippi River. At British insistence, the Americans promised not to persecute Loyalists and to restore any property seized during the war, but many Loyalists left for Great Britain, Canada, or other parts of the empire. Until independence, the 13 colonies in North America had only been one part of Britain's empire in the Western Hemisphere. In Canada and the West Indies, where planters feared slave revolts, colonists refused Americans' appeal to join the war against the mother country. But with the Treaty of Paris, the United States of America became the first independent nation in the hemisphere, reflecting its boundaries not in the unity of a region, but in the circumstances of its birth. This British cartoon from 1779 is titled The Horse America Throwing His Master. It lampoons King George III for being unable to keep control of the colonies. In the background, a French officer carries a flag adorned with the fleur-de-lis, the symbol of that country, the colonists' ally. Powerful satirical attacks on public authorities, including the king, were commonplace in 18th century Britain. After 1777, the focus of the War of Independence shifted to the South, where it culminated in 1781 with the British defeat at Yorktown. This 1781 French engraving shows the surrender of Lord Charles Cornwallis's army at Yorktown, ending the War of Independence. The French fleet is visible just offshore. A newly independent United States occupied only a small part of the North American continent in 1783. I hope that you've enjoyed this lecture. This is a review of the 4 focus questions that we went over. Next lecture, we're going to be discussing how America set up this new nation and how slavery and women fit into it. I hope you join me then, and I hope that you've had fun with this. As always, I welcome your feedback. Please email me with any comments or questions you may have. Have a great week.